Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adela Pineda Franco, and I am the director of the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies here at UT Austin. And it is a real pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Steven Levitsky, who is visiting us from Boston, my old town, a year ago. Steven Levitsky doesn't need an introduction, and he's actually going to be introduced by my colleague, Raul Madrid. But I wanted to let you know a little bit about the framework of this talk and why and how we found this talk, which is called Hackett Lecture. Hackett, Charles Hackett, was the first director of the Institute in the 1940s. When he came as director, he wanted to establish a highly reputed Institute of Latin American Studies, and also built a library with the foundation of the Genaro Garcia collection that was acquired in the 1920s by UT. So this was the enterprise of Charles Hackett, the idea to have an institute and a great library together. And this legacy is honored today. The idea of having a series called Hackett came from one of our former professors at Lilas, who is Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt just turned 100 years old and told me to tell Steve that he was sorry not to be able to attend the talk. The desire of Carl Schmitt was twofold. He wanted the Hackett Lecture, he wanted the Hackett to be, okay, sorry, so a little bit far, okay, so there, okay. Carl wanted the Hackett Lecture to be about democracy and its future. So it should have a subtitle, What is the Future of Democracy? And this was in the 1940s. And here we are thinking about democracy again. The other reason was to remember Charles Hackett. This was Carl Schmitt's desire. So without more preamble, let me welcome my colleague from the government department, Raul Madrid, who will introduce Steve Levitsky. Thank you so much.
So first I'd like to thank Adela Pineda and Lilas for sponsoring this talk, and of course for Carl Schmitt, thank Carl Schmitt as well. I want to thank Paloma Diaz and Susana Sharp for organizing and promoting it. So I'm very happy to welcome Steve Levitsky, who will be delivering the Hackett Lecture this year on the state of democracy in Latin America. Steve, as you know, is the David Rockefeller Professor of Government and the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. He is one of the country's foremost experts on political parties, democracy, and authoritarianism in Latin America and around the world. He is also the author of numerous scholarly books and articles, including How Democracies Die, which he co-authored with Daniel Ziblatt, Competitive Authoritarianism and Revolution and Dictatorship, which he co-authored with Lucan Way. Steve is also one of the few political scientists to have become a public intellectual, and I mean that in a good way. How Democracies Die, for example, became an international bestseller recommended by Barack Obama, among other people. Steve is someone who weighs in regularly on policy debates, but without losing his concern for scholarly rigor and nuance. If you go online, you can find plenty of examples of Steve weighing in on some of the most important political issues of the day. Or by that night, if you go on Facebook, you'll also see him weighing in.
Don't do that.
In fact, when we were looking for a room to host this talk, one of the potential on-campus locations initially turned us down on the grounds that they had watched some of Steve's videos and found that he was too opinionated. Well, I would say opinionated is what we want. And I'm not just saying that because I agree with 95% of his opinions, which I do. We need more opinions at the University of Texas, not fewer. And so on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to give us his opinion on the state of democracy in Latin America. Steve.
Thanks, Raul, and thanks, Adela, and the lecture series for the invitation. I'm really curious to hear the story now. God. Yeah, I don't think this is going to be as opinionated a lecture as I was just set up to give. I want to say, first of all, after thank you, that the last 35 years have been far and away the most democratic in Latin American history. This is the average VDEM score for liberal democracy in Latin America since 1900. I think it shows it pretty well. Now, the conventional wisdom these days, and it's pretty strong, is that democracy is in retreat across the world and in Latin America. That we're seeing a sort of authoritarian resurgence in Latin America and globally. I want to offer a somewhat different perspective. I think we're seeing a surprising degree of democratic resilience in Latin America. Let me try to defend that. Latin American democracies, as you all know, have faced a slew of challenges over the last 15 or 20 years. For one, and very importantly, the international environment is much less favorable to democracy than it was in the 1990s. The 1990s and the early 2000s were a really unique period in global history, one that was uniquely favorable to democracy. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States and Europe, for about 15 years, became the world's dominant military, economic, and ideological power. And they used that power to promote democracy like never before. So for about 15 years, democracy was really the only game in town. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, both left-wing dictatorships and anti-communist dictatorships lost their external patrons. And for a while, there were really no global counter-hegemonic powers to which autocrats could turn for support. Russia in the 90s was in a state of collapse. China was just beginning to take off. So in the 1990s, governments across the global south pretty much had to be on good terms with the West. That post-Cold War international environment encouraged unprecedented democratization. The number of democracies in the world more than doubled between 1985 and 2005. And in fact, democracy emerged in some pretty unexpected places. Social scientists have identified several factors that clearly make democratization more likely. Industrialization, big middle class, a robust civil society, low levels of inequality, a functioning state. In the 1990s, democracy emerged in countries with few or none of those conditions. Countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Bolivia. That's not because our theories were wrong. It's because the international environment was so favorable to democracy that it overwhelmed the impact of things like wealth and class structure. That was the 1990s and early 2000s. Over the last 15 or 20 years, though, global conditions have changed for the worse. We've entered the post-Cold War era. The rise of China and Russia obviously have altered the geopolitical balance of power, putting an end to Western liberal hegemony. And at the same time, the power, the prestige, the self-confidence of the liberal West has declined pretty dramatically. So the days when the United States and Europe were the world's dominant military, economic, ideological powers are long gone, and democracy is no longer the only game in town. Aspiring autocrats no longer fear international isolation. They can turn to China, to Russia, to other regional powers for support. And the West no longer promotes democracy as consistently or as energetically as it did in the 1990s. So the international environment is considerably less favorable for democracy today than it was back in the 1990s. That's not the only unfavorable condition. The economic environment's also been pretty difficult. Latin America experienced a terrible, terrible economic downturn between 1998 and 2002, followed by a commodities boom, followed by a pretty nasty hangover from the commodities boom beginning in about 2014. Latin America as a whole achieved about zero growth between 2014 and 2022. Practically another lost decade. Brazil and Argentina have experienced particularly poor economic performance. Mexico hasn't done a heck of a lot better. Really, really tough economic times. The economic crisis obviously was exacerbated by the pandemic, which hit Latin America especially hard. Add to that widespread corruption and the highest level of violent crime in the world, and you've got some pretty crappy government performance over the last 10, 15 years. In short, elected governments across Latin America have not performed very well in the last couple of decades, and poor performance tends to undermine new and fragile democracies. Yet democracy persists across much of Latin America, most of Latin America. Here you see the average VDM score, liberal democracy score in Latin America since the beginning of the third wave, since 1980. As you can see, there is a slight dip, if you look hard enough, since 2005, but the region remains considerably more democratic than it was in the early 1990s, and far more democratic than any other period in history. Here's a more qualitative assessment. As I see it, the region has suffered two clear democratic losses, Nicaragua and Venezuela. Peru, Bolivia, Honduras, Ecuador, more recently El Salvador have experienced backsliding into what I would call competitive authoritarianism, but Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Honduras eventually slid back into democracy. The other democracies in Latin America have survived. Argentine democracies now survive for nearly 40 years, longer than ever before in history. Democracies in Brazil and Uruguay and Chile and Panama have survived more than 30 years. Democracies in Mexico, Peru, Dominican Republic have survived more than 20 years. In fact, according to Freedom House's Global Freedom Index, 5 Latin American countries today are more democratic than the United States. Argentina gets a better democracy score than the United States. That's not an accident. That's not a typo. There are no efforts to restrict voting in Argentina. There are no violent threats against election workers in Argentina. No one rejects the elections or tries to overturn elections in Argentina. Now, Brazil, as you can see, gets a slightly lower score than the United States, but its recent presidential election went a heck of a lot more smoothly than the US 2020 election. So even though Bolsonaro tried to undermine the legitimacy of the electoral process, even though it was a very close election, I was stunned by this. Virtually nobody on the political right questioned the results. The president of Congress, a Bolsonaro ally, immediately recognized Lula's victory and declared he was ready to work with it. The elected governors of Brazil's largest states, Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais, who were also Bolsonaro allies, immediately recognized Lula's victory. Almost nobody on the right seriously challenged the result. And despite fears of military intervention, the military remained entirely on the sideline. So, competitive elections persist in Latin America, and for the first time in Latin American history, militaries are remaining on the sideline. There's only been one full-on military coup in Latin America over the last 2 decades, from Honduras in 2009. So my initial point, my opening point, is that democracies are surviving in Latin America in the 21st century despite some pretty difficult conditions. And I think there are kind of 2 basic reasons for that resilience, that what I think is a surprising level of resilience. One factor is that most Latin American societies are marked by a pretty considerable degree of pluralism. Resources are relatively well dispersed in society, and crucially, they are not concentrated in the hands of the state. Venezuela is an exception here because of oil. Nicaragua and Paraguay have unusually weak oppositions, which is not good for democracy. But in most of Latin America, no one has the power or the resources to establish or maintain hegemonic rule. As long as militaries remain on the sidelines, governments are just too weak to consolidate autocracies. The other factor that I think is sustaining democratic rule in the region is the institutionalization of elections. Eliminating elections has become almost unthinkable in Latin America. Latin Americans may despise their politicians, they may deeply distrust many of their democratic institutions, but they like having the ability to vote out governments that they don't like. Multi-party elections, competitive elections, continue to enjoy broad legitimacy across Latin America. Nobody is in the streets of Latin America calling for the Russian or the Chinese model. This combination of societal pluralism and the entrenchment of elections, I think, gives democracy a sort of fighting chance despite what are pretty difficult conditions. It allows democracies like Colombia, Brazil, hopefully Mexico, to muddle through despite the election of autocratic-minded presidents. And it allows democracies to bounce back after lapses into competitive authoritarianism, like in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. So, outside of Nicaragua and Venezuela, democracy, today at least, is not dying in contemporary Latin America. It is muddling through. And I want to suggest, first of all, that that is not a small thing. Anybody who lived through or studied Latin American political regimes prior to the 1980s knows that that is not a small thing. But muddling through is not thriving. And most Latin American democracies are not thriving. Public discontent is soaring, and Latin Americans are increasingly dissatisfied with their democracies. This data is from 4 years ago, but it hasn't changed much. According to the Latino Barometer survey for 2018, 24% of Latin Americans said they were satisfied with their democracy. 16% of Mexicans, 11% of Peruvians and Salvadorans, 9% of Brazilians said they were satisfied with their democracy. In several countries, as you know, public discontent has spilled over onto the streets. Brazil experienced massive waves of protests in 2013, 15, and 16, eventually bringing down President Rousseff. And Chile, extraordinary uprising brought more than 1 million people to the streets in 2019. Polls showed something like 80% public support for those protests. In Ecuador, mass protests in 2019 forced the president to move to flee Quito, to Guayaquil. Colombia experienced a massive two-month wave of protests in 2021. Again, surveys found that something like 75% of Colombians supported the protesters. Latin Americans are also venting their frustration and anger at the polls. Take a look at the 14 Democratic presidential elections held in Latin America since 2019. It is often said, you will often hear, that Latin America currently is experiencing a sort of a new pink tide, another turn to the left with the election of Boric and Petro and now Lula. But in reality, what we are seeing is an anti-incumbent wave, a dramatic one. Left of center candidates have won 8 of the last 14 Democratic presidential elections in Latin America since 2019, compared to only 3 for the right, so the left's doing pretty well. But opposition candidates have won 14 out of 14 Democratic presidential elections held since 2019. 14 out of 14. The last time an incumbent won a Democratic election in Latin America, an incumbent party, was Costa Rica in 2018. It's a long time ago. Jesus Christ could not be reelected in Latin America today. That's an example of the kind of opinionated statement that gets me uninvited to dinner. All right. But it's more than just anti-incumbent voting. Latin Americans are not just voting out incumbents in favor of the main opposition party. With the exception of Argentina and Uruguay, they are bypassing established opposition parties in favor of outsiders. Bukele in El Salvador, Castro in Honduras, Boric in Chile, Castillo in Peru, Petro in Colombia, Rodrigo Chavez in Costa Rica. So established parties, established party systems are weakening and even collapsing in Mexico and Colombia and Brazil and El Salvador and Honduras, even in Costa Rica and Chile, because voters are turning away from established parties towards political newcomers, many of which come from outside the political establishment. So outsiders are consistently beating insiders today. It's one pattern you see across the region. Outsiders are beating insiders across Latin America. And they are increasingly doing it, or many of them are doing it, with an anti-establishment discourse. This is, oh man, behind on my slides. There you go. Insiders beating outsiders. Outsiders beating established parties with an anti-establishment discourse is populism. Populists are political outsiders who mobilize disaffected voters against the entire political establishment. Populists attack traditional parties and politicians from across the political spectrum, treating them as corrupt, characterizing them as corrupt, as oligarchic, as unrepresentative, and promising to sweep them away in favor of a more authentic democracy. Now, not all the outsiders getting elected in Latin America are populists. We can debate endlessly who's a populist, who's not. They're not all populists. But we clearly have seen a rise in the number of successful populist candidates. And this is a problem, I want to suggest, because successful populism poses a threat to democracy. 21st century democracies, as you all know, tend not to die at the hands of the military anymore. They tend to die at the hands of elected leaders who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert, to weaken, sometimes to kill democracy. This is Hugo Chavez, it's Fujimori, Evo Morales, Correa in Ecuador, Bukele in El Salvador. Most of these guys were populists. Populist presidents, I want to suggest quickly, that threaten democracy in a couple of ways, or for a couple of reasons. First of all, populists tend to be political outsiders. And outsiders tend, or often, lack a strong commitment to the institutions of representative democracy. Whatever you may think of established party politicians, and I recognize political scientists are the only people who actually like established party politicians, but whatever you may think of them, most of them are at least minimally committed to working within democratic institutions. They've generally spent their career, their professional career, working within democratic institutions. They're pretty experienced with the nuts and bolts of democratic politics, things like negotiation, coalition building. They know how to achieve their goals through democratic institutions. They know how to get bills through Congress. They know how to work the courts. And they tend to have a stake in the preservation of those institutions because that's their livelihood. They are professional politicians. It's what they do. With political outsiders, it's more of a crapshoot. Outsiders are political amateurs. That means they have very little experience working within democratic institutions. They often lack the skills to deal effectively with opposition, with the media, to build and sustain political coalitions, to succeed in the give and take of legislative politics. And many of them lack the patience for it as well. I remember a former aide to Alberto Fujimori was quoted as saying that Fujimori couldn't stand the idea of having to take the president of the Senate out to lunch every time he wanted to pass a bill. That's what you freaking do in a democracy. Now, some outsiders turn out to be Democrats. Alejandro Toledo, Ollanta Humala, Fernando Lugo were Democrats. But many of the outsiders elected in Latin America over the last 30 years have not been Democrats. Fujimori, Chavez, Lucio Gutierrez and Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Bukele in El Salvador. In fact, every president, every elected president who has shut down Congress in Latin America over the last 3 decades has been an outsider. But an even bigger problem, the real core problem with populists, I think, is how they get elected. It's how they get elected. Populists campaign on a pledge to destroy what they describe as a corrupt, unrepresentative system. Sweeping away the elite and its institutions is a pretty radical mandate. It's a radical mandate, but it is what these guys get elected to do. They say they're going to do it, and it's the mandate that they earn. The problem is that the old system that populists have campaigned against is usually a democracy. The corrupt and unrepresentative institutions that populists promise to sweep away are things like legislatures, political parties, Supreme Courts. And in fact, when populists win power, win the presidency in Latin America, they very often find that the old elite that they've been railing against, in fact, controls those other institutions. The traditional parties often maintain a majority in the Congress. Their appointees sit in the judiciary, and in many cases, they wrote the political rules of the game. For a political outsider who's just been elected on a pledge to bury the old political elite, to then turn around and sit down and negotiate with that elite, build coalitions with that elite, govern with that elite, that's a betrayal of their electoral mandate. And betraying your electoral mandate can be politically costly. Ask Lucio Gutierrez. So populist presidents, I want to suggest, have a political incentive to assault democratic institutions, to circumvent the Congress, to try to pack the courts, maybe even rewrite the constitutional rules of the game. That's a recipe for institutional crisis, for constitutional crisis. It's a recipe for a showdown between a popular president who promises to sweep away what he or she calls corrupt and unrepresentative institutions, and an old political elite that views those very institutions as their last bastion of defense. Populists usually win those showdowns because when a newly elected populist president takes on the old elite, public opinion usually overwhelmingly favors the president. Fujimori, Chavez, Correa, Bukele each began their assault on the old regime with 70 or 80% public support. And when populist presidents prevail in these showdowns with established institutions, they can concentrate a hell of a lot of power. They can close Congress and elect a new one with a pro-government majority. They can pack the courts, pack the electoral authorities. They can rewrite the Constitution to concentrate power and weaken their opponents. We saw this in Peru under Fujimori. We saw it in Venezuela under Chavez. We saw it in Ecuador under Correa. We're seeing it now in El Salvador under Bukele. Populism isn't the only way democracies die in Latin America today, but it's becoming the leading cause of death in the region. It's becoming the leading cause of death. So why are so many populist politicians or populist outsiders getting elected to the presidency? I think there is a supply side and a demand side to this question. Most observers focus on the demand side. They focus on the question of why Latin American voters are turning to anti-system politicians. That's a really important question, and I want to spend a minute on it. Public anger in Latin America has a bunch of causes. One of them is extreme inequality. For voters to back a populist outsider who promises to destroy the entire elite, there usually has to be a hell of a gap between that elite and everyday citizens. Social inequality helps to create and sustain that gap. So inequality is very important here. But the most important driver of public discontent in Latin America, I want to suggest, is state weakness. If you want to understand why Latin American voters get so angry at politicians, angry enough to throw them all overboard in favor of a clown, or a priest, or a general, or a pop star, you've got to look at the state. You've got to look at state capacity. And by state capacity, I mean the ability of state institutions to carry out basic tasks that the state sets out for itself: collecting taxes, building roads and schools, implementing social programs, providing public security, upholding the rule of law. When states are weak, it is almost impossible for governments to govern well. No matter how honest they are, no matter how well trained they are at the Lyndon Johnson School, no matter how well-intentioned they are going to likely fail. Where states can't tax, where they can't get bureaucrats to do what they want, where they can't systematically enforce the rule of law, even the best intentioned governments are not going to be able to deliver the goods. They won't be able to pave roads, maintain schools and hospitals, control corruption, provide security to their citizens. Latin American governments are performing badly not because elected leaders are evil or incompetent, although some of them are. Latin American governments are performing badly because they're governing with weak states. Take corruption. Corruption becomes a problem when state institutions cannot get politicians and bureaucrats to comply with the law. Corruption is not new in Latin America, but thanks to democracy and a free press, it's getting exposed like never before. So in Brazil, the Lava Jato scandals, you will know, implicated hundreds of politicians from across the political spectrum, including former presidents, governors, major presidential candidates, congressional leaders. In Peru, every single president elected since 1990 has been charged with corruption. 3 of them are in jail, and a 4th committed suicide in the face of imminent arrest. In El Salvador, the last 4 elected presidents prior to Bukele, all charged with corruption. One's in prison, another died while awaiting trial. 2 of them fled to Nicaragua to avoid arrest. 4 out of 4. President Otto Perez of Guatemala, Ricardo Martinelli of Panama, also jailed on corruption charges. And earlier this year, of course, former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez was arrested and extradited to the United States on drug trafficking charges. People don't like corruption. It really pisses people off. So the failure to control corruption, a very public failure to control corruption, is a major source of public anger. Another source of public anger, as you all know, is crime and insecurity. Crime and insecurity are also rooted in state weakness. Providing security is a basic function of any modern state. Most European countries have an annual average of 1 homicide per 100,000 people. Canada is an average of 2 homicides per 100,000 people. The United States, which is the highest homicide rate among industrialized countries, there were 5 homicides per 100,000 people last year. In Colombia, and Mexico, and Brazil, Guatemala, and Honduras, by contrast, there were more than 25 homicides per 100,000 in 2019. In El Salvador and Venezuela, there were more than 50 homicides per 100,000 in 2019. That is 10 times the murder rate in the United States, where the murder rate's pretty high. It's 50 times the murder rate in Europe. So many Latin American states are failing at the basic task of protecting their citizens. That, too, is a source of public anger. Corruption and insecurity are 2 of the leading sources of public discontent today in Latin America, according to polls, both of them rooted in state weakness. My general point is this: where states are ineffective, it is almost impossible for governments to govern well. Again, where states can't tax, can't get bureaucrats to do what they want them to do, can't enforce the rule of law, even the best governments are going to fail. And when governments consistently fail to deliver the goods, public discontent inevitably rises. Now that's bad enough, but the problem is made much worse by social inequality. State weakness always hits the poor the hardest. The rich can live with an ineffective state. The rich have private schools. They have private hospitals. They can protect themselves with private security guards and private lawyers. And when they must deal with state bureaucrats, they can always pay bribes or find a well-connected friend. The poor have none of those options. They're stuck with corrupt police, lousy public schools, lousy public hospitals. They have no choice but to rely on corrupt and inefficient public bureaucracies. And they live in a world where judges and law enforcement officials always seem to be working for somebody else. This is crucial. Latin American states are perceived not only as incompetent, not only as indifferent, but also widely perceived as unfair. They're perceived to benefit a certain few at the expense of the many. This combination of state weakness and inequality is what drives populism. When perceptions of government incompetence, government indifference, government unfairness persist over time, from one government to another government to a third government, citizens start to conclude that all the political parties are the same, that all politicians are corrupt and no good, that nobody in the political elite represents them. It's those citizens who are most likely to vote for political outsiders who promise to throw everybody out. Now, the demand side of populism, which I've just attempted to describe, is very important. It is not new. Inequality and state weakness are endemic to much of Latin America. I want to suggest that what's new in Latin America is not so much the demand for populism, it's not so much public anger, it's the supply side of populism. It is much easier to be a populist today in Latin America than it was 50 years ago, because political establishments are weakening. And I want to spend the rest of the talk today talking about that. What the hell is a political establishment? By political establishment, I mean the network of individuals and organizations with the resources that politicians need to get elected. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to focus on 3 types of establishment actor. One of them is political parties. Parties are important because they nominate candidates for public office. They are gatekeepers. Where parties are strong, their control over the candidate selection process enables them to basically serve as political gatekeepers, filtering out anti-system outsiders. A second type of establishment organization is major interest groups like business associations or labor unions. Interest groups traditionally are a critical source of finance and other campaign resources, activists. Candidates everywhere need resources. They need money. They need activists. Historically, big business and big labor have been major sources of those resources. Third type of establishment actor is major media outlets, particularly major newspapers, television networks. Access to the media historically is critical to candidates' ability to reach voters. Without access to the media, most parties, most candidates cannot achieve the name recognition necessary to do well in elections. Now, I am not Noam Chomsky. I'm not arguing that the establishment is a monolithic actor. Parties, interest groups, media outlets do not constitute a single block or a single set of interests. There's always pluralism and competition among them, or not always, usually. But collectively, establishments do tend to impose certain parameters on politics, both in terms of political style and policy substance. There are certain norms governing how politicians are supposed to behave, how they dress, what they say, how they treat one another, how they treat the media. And there are certain policy positions that are considered and treated by the establishment as beyond the pale. Politicians who exceed those boundaries, politicians who violate certain behavioral norms or push certain extremist policies, they get shunned by the establishment. That means that party leaders won't nominate them. It means that leading business associations, unions, other interest groups will not contribute to their campaigns. And it means that mainstream media either won't cover them or will provide very negative coverage of them. Half a century? That stuff mattered a lot. Being shunned by the establishment mattered during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even the 1980s, because establishments in the 20th century held a monopoly over the resources politicians needed to get elected. Party leaders controlled the candidate selection process. There were no primaries. If you were not on good terms with party leaders, you could not run for office. A relatively small number of interest groups provided the vast bulk of the finance and other campaign resources. Again, business, labor unions. If you were shunned by big donors, you couldn't raise money. And if you couldn't raise money, you couldn't compete. Finally, 50 years ago, and I know the young folks here will find this unimaginable, but a few major media outlets dominated the media scene. There were 2 or 3 major television networks and a handful of influential newspapers. So if the New York Times, the BBC, Global decided that you were unfit for office, you were shut out. The fact that established political parties, interest groups, and media outlets monopolized or nearly monopolized access to the resources politicians needed to get elected meant that politicians pretty much had to be on good terms with the establishment. Politicians needed the approval of party leaders to run for office. They needed the approval of major interest groups to fund their campaign. They needed the approval of major media outlets to reach voters. That dependence on the establishment had important consequences for democracy. 20th century politicians, for better or worse, couldn't just respond to voters. They had to strike some kind of a balance between appealing to voters on the one hand and remaining acceptable to the establishment on the other hand. That was not particularly democratic, but it had a moderating effect on politics because it kept most of the extreme politicians and issues off the agenda. For better or worse, that's how 20th century democracy worked. 20th century democracies were systems of elite competition that rarely transcended the boundaries of the establishment. But of course, the days of the establishment or establishment monopoly are over. Establishments across the globe have lost their control over critical electoral resources, which means they're losing their power over politicians. Parties no longer monopolize candidate selection. Politicians can either hijack parties through primaries like Trump or create their own damn parties like Fujimori, Correa, Bukele, and many others. Interest groups have lost their monopoly over campaign finance because candidates can raise money online. Bernie flippin' Sanders outraised Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden in 2016, 2020. And of course, social media has dramatically eroded the influence of established media. Today, Twitter, Facebook, other social media allow candidates to reach voters even if they're shunned by the establishment media. I traveled to Sao Paulo, Brazil in July 2018, just as the 2018 election campaign was beginning. And I was brought down by a couple of young Jewish liberal business leaders who kind of read the room in Brazil and saw that all of their friends were eventually going to back Bolsonaro. And they brought me down, phenomenally unsuccessfully, to talk to their rich Sao Paulo business friends and tell them that Bolsonaro was not the way to go. No, not successful. Anyway, so I met in this trip with a bunch of wealthy business people in Sao Paulo. Almost all of them backed Alckmin, who was the sort of center-right candidate at the time. Alckmin was at about 4% of the polls. He was badly losing the polls. Every single business leader I talked to, and these were smart guys, informed guys, was convinced that Alckmin was going to win because he was backed by the parties of the Central, which gave him, because of the electoral law, a huge advantage in free television time during the campaign. So Alckmin had like an hour a night in TV time, and Bolsonaro got 6 or 7 seconds a night. Bolsonaro was allowed to wave, and that was it. Nobody I talked to during this trip to Sao Paulo mentioned WhatsApp or YouTube. But that's what Bolsonaro used to reach voters, and of course, he won. Politicians today do not need the establishment very much. They can raise money online, they can reach voters through social media. For politicians, this is incredibly liberating. They can now respond directly to voters without worrying much about what the establishment thinks. They can violate established norms. They can build a reputation as a maverick or as an outsider who's not beholden to the elite and is willing to tell it like it is. They can say and do things that were previously considered off limits. Think about Trump, Bolsonaro, Bukele, Milei in Argentina. In fact, candidates today, not only can they say and do things that were previously off limit, they can campaign openly against the establishment. In fact, that's a pretty good way to win votes. Again, there's always, I think, been a demand for populism in Latin America. What's really new is what's happening on the supply side. It's much easier to bypass the establishment than it was 50 or 100 years ago. When Perón beat the Argentine establishment in 1946, it took the kind of mass mobilization you see once in a century. When Bukele beat the Salvadoran establishment, not that hard. He mobilized 2 million people on Facebook and Twitter. Pedro Castillo had the entire, and I mean the entire, Peruvian establishment against him. Business, the media, the political elite, all of the city of Lima was lined up against him. Castillo had no party organization, he had no money, he had no talent, and yet he still won the presidency. Now this new scenario is much more democratic than the old one. Peru's election last year may have been the most democratic election in the history of the world. A provincial nobody beat the entire Lima establishment. And because politicians no longer need the establishment, they can be much more responsive to voters. They can give the voters what they want. But what happens when voters are so angry that what they want is someone who's going to take a wrecking ball to Congress, to the court, to other institutions of representative democracy? So weakening the establishment opens the door to new political forces, which is democratic. But at the same time, it leaves democracies more, and I think increasingly, vulnerable to anti-system forces, which oftentimes turn out to be authoritarian. This is a hell of a paradox. The weakening of political establishments is unquestionably democratizing. But that very democratization process may pose a serious threat to liberal democratic institutions. If you go back to the 18th and 19th century, Western elites were terrified of democracy. They were terrified of giving power to the people. They were terrified of rule by the people. One of the things that eventually made democracy acceptable to Western elites was the protective power of political establishments. 19th and 20th century political establishments imposed pretty powerful constraints on democratic competition, transforming what could have been a highly plebiscitary, highly majoritarian politics into a much more bounded, elite-centered competition. But the days of Schumpeterian democracy, the days of elite democracy, are coming to an end in Europe, in the United States, and in Latin America. The establishment's gatekeeping powers have eroded, and it's pretty hard, at least for me, to see that process reversing. So we are likely to see more Trumps, more Bolsonaros, more Bukeles, more Castillos. How Latin American democracies, or any democracies, will hold up in that new populist era, I think is still anybody's guess. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I guess I'm going to call.
Okay. Otherwise, we have nothing to use that microphone for.
So if anybody would like to ask a question, you can come up and speak it into the microphone. That's what you need to do. Question.
Is this really rainwater?
There's a question. So you're identifying the political establishment or the absence of a political establishment as one of the main problems here. So my question is, are there reforms, electoral reforms, institutional reforms, that would solve the problem without necessarily having to bring back the political establishment in a way that it would be undemocratic?
That's a great question. I'm not a good seer of the future, though there are people who see the future well, and I tend to, at best, explain things in the past, but predicting the future is really hard. It's tough. I mean, there are certainly steps that can be taken to regulate social media more than occurs in Latin America and the United States. Western Europe regulates social media better, more and better, I think, than the Americans. There are steps that can be taken to strengthen political parties and political party elites, their gatekeeping capacity. Now, that's probably not going to be popular or feel very legitimate. I mean, I like voting in primaries. You know, I don't want to go back to the days of the smoke-filled rooms where party elites chose candidates. But so there certainly are sort of mundane institutional steps that can be taken, certainly democratically, to shore up elites a little bit. To me, it doesn't feel like a long-term solution. You know, the other thing, though, is that gives me a little bit of optimism, but this is pretty ill-informed optimism, is that, you know, societies have adapted to changes in media technology before, right? We were terrified by radio. We were sure that radio was going to bring fascism. We were terrified by television. We thought it was going to give rise to demagogues, and maybe it has. But societies, both in terms of government regulation, political behavior, and voter behavior, we adapted. And it's certainly possible, I'm not predicting it, but it's certainly possible that political elites, government regulations, parties, voters will learn how, sort of from below, how to live in a more open system than we had in the past. But I cannot see well into the future, enough in the future to be more concrete.
I can speak from here, that's okay. First of all, thank you for being here with us. And I noticed at the beginning of the presentation, whenever the slides were describing like liberal democracies and dictatorships, whenever you were talking about dictatorships, you outlined Nicaragua, Venezuela, and then there was a difference made in Cuba, where it was in parentheses. Could you expand a little bit more on that?
Cuba doesn't experience a regime change during the third wave. These were third wave outcomes. Two democracies fell into dictatorship in the late 20th, early 21st century, Nicaragua and Venezuela. Cuba always was a dictatorship, and that's why it was in parentheses.
Okay,
That's all.
thank you. That was my question.
Sorry, I should have been clear.
Yeah, I have a question. Can I ask a question, please?
The only thing is we're recording this, and
and so it's better to have a microphone so that in the recording there's questions. Thank you.
I actually, I put the microphone close to that you can hear. My question maybe comes from the field of culture, but it has to do with, in this scenario where democratic elections are posing a danger to stable nation states, what do you think is the future of the nation state in the sense of, these new waves of populism? But the question I want to ask comes from the idea that from the 19th century on, the paradox of nation states was who were the people, who could belong to the people and had the right to vote or had the right to civilized countries, right? And from Sarmiento on, when he was talking about Rosas in the 19th century, this was the question. And I guess now with the democratization of media, right, it's not just print, but the democratization of media has changed the idea of the people, who votes, who rules. And so what would be the function of the nation state? Who can actually give some stability to the future in this scenario?
Woof. Man, it's a great question. First of all, I don't think I would go as far as to say that democratic elections are posing a danger. I think there's a certain, democracy always comes with a certain amount of risk. Any kind of open political system comes with a certain amount of risk, and I think with the decline of establishments, it's going to be more uncertain, more unstable, maybe a higher risk. I wouldn't call it a danger. I mean, you point to another great challenge. I'm not going to be able to say much intelligently about nation states, or certainly the future of nation states, but you do point to another really important challenge to liberal democracies in the 21st century, which is the challenge of inclusion, right? A lot of the regimes that we called democracies for many years, including the United States, were not fully democracies because not all adult citizens living in the territory had full political rights, right? So the United States, by mainstream comparative politics definitions, becomes a democracy in 1965. And most Latin American democracies where indigenous people did not enjoy citizenship and suffrage rights until well into the 20th century, could not, by definition, be full democracy. Those days are also over, I think, which is a very good thing and a very democratic thing. But it is triggering reactions in, this may not have been the direction your question was leading, but I guess the answer, the direction I'm going to go, which is it's leading to usually right-wing exclusionary reactions that are threatening democracy. That's happening in the United States. That's happened in different ways in Bolivia, to some extent in Brazil. We're seeing it play out in Peru. And coming to terms with a fully inclusive democracy in which everybody, everyone has the right to vote, and all political actors have real representation, or at least the ability to be represented, is a challenge for elites in diverse, unequal societies. And I think Latin America, the United States is in the middle of the political earthquake that we're suffering is fundamentally about that. And I think that is coming to Latin America. I think it's a challenge that we're about to slide into.
Thank you. I want to ask you about what I regard as a new type of institutions in the region. Constitutions, constitutionalism, constitutional courts, constitutional jurisprudence. Seems to me that over the last 30, 40 years, there has been a rise of that sphere as significant. Constitution drafting, constitution making.
Did you say fear of it?
No, I said...
Oh, that's sphere. You said sphere.
Sphere.
Sorry, got it.
And it seems to me on your map of old establishment versus new forces, the entire constitutional sphere is somewhere in between. On the one hand, it may be representing old establishment in the old regime. At the same time, it opens up all sorts of possibilities for challenging the the regime, and all those corruption charges and term limits litigation and many other examples essentially boil down to what constitutional courts or Supreme Courts rule in the end. Could you say something about the place of the entire constitutionalism business in Latin America and how it maps onto your old elites, new politics matrix? Thank you.
I hadn't thought much about the latter part of that question. There's no question I did not talk about the judicial and constitutional sphere very much today. There's no question that is a major development in Latin American democracies over the last 30 years. Constitutional reform is not new in most of Latin America, but judicial politics have been transformed dramatically. Judiciaries historically in Latin America were not major political actors, and they have been empowered in many countries, and I think by and large in a positive way. And I think constitutionalism, by and large, despite the fear of that sphere in many places, has by and large been positive. I'm not sure that the constitutionalism, I guess I see it as somewhat orthogonal to the establishment, non-establishment divide that I made, because I mean I think all political institutions can operate in different social contexts. So you can have electoral politics in a world in which 3% of the population votes, or you can have electoral politics in a context in which everybody votes. You can have electoral politics like we did in the 20th century that are dominated by establishments, plays out one way. You can have electoral politics in a context in which establishments are weak, and it plays out another way. I think that constitutions, constitutional reform, the opportunities that are opened by constitutional politics and constitutional institutions, also that process could be dominated by establishments, or it could empower non-establishment groups. I'm not sure that it has an independent effect.
For those of us who were alive in the 1970s, we remember that the main threat to democracy was the military. They would intervene to overthrow the civilian government. Your talk did not touch it, I think, at all on the military. In the recent election in Brazil, there was talk and thoughts that Bolsonaro had excellent relations with the military, and this could be a decisive factor in a close tally at the end. Where is the military now with respect to your analysis on democracy?
Great question. The reason why I didn't talk about it is the military is still mostly on the sidelines, which is pretty freaking good news. Again, there are, as my colleague at the Kennedy School likes to say, Ricardo Hausmann, there are many ways to die. So unfortunately, military coups aren't the only way for democracy to die. But the military intervention has, as you know very well, declined dramatically since the 1970s. And there has been concern and some discussion in the last decade about a resurgence of the military in the region. There was an out-and-out coup in Honduras in 2009. The military put its thumb on the scale in the Lula trial in Brazil, made some horrendous statements over the last 4 or 5 years, Bolsonaro embraced the military, brought military actors into his government. Really I don't know what the word is. I was surprised to see the military begin to question, some military officials begin to question the electoral process, echoing Bolsonaro in the 2022 campaign. There was concern after the security forces played a role in nudging Evo Morales out of power in 2019. There was sort of a fear that the military was coming back. I mean, the jury is still out, but for the most part, in Brazil and in the rest of the region, the military is staying on the sidelines. The military was not, at the end of the day, a player in the 2022 election. It behaved in a thoroughly professional way, and I don't know, hopefully we'll know at some point, the history of what Bolsonaro did during his silent, was it 48 or 72 hours after the election? you know, I don't know how many phone calls he made to generals or during that time, but apparently he came up empty because he ceded power pretty easily. So far, the return of the military has been a dud. There has not been substantial military intervention in politics in the last 25 years. That could change, but so far so good, I guess I would say.
Thank you for your talk. You illustrated this picture of a positive feedback loop between populism and a weak state, essentially bureaucratic incompetency as a whole. I guess raising the question of how we break this positive feedback loop, open-ended question, but would you suggest that the reinforcement of these democratic states away from populism could solve this issue, or maybe be used as a tool to break this positive feedback loop?
Could what be used as a tool to break this?
Sorry, so...
It sounds like a question way above my pay grade.
I guess I'm just, it seemed as though you dichotomized populism, like these populist electors versus the more traditional politicians in this political establishment, saying that these populist electors are reinforcing the populace's anger and maybe you would say fervor for extreme change, and that it's feeding off of itself. I guess if you can elaborate on how they could break this loop.
Oh boy, that's one of those questions. If I had to answer that, I would have a much better paying job. I think you actually said it in a much more articulate way than I did. I think there is a pretty nasty feedback loop going on, which is that states don't work very well. People get pretty angry. Eventually, a populist gets elected in. I don't want to overgeneralize, but most of the time, populists end up leaving behind an even weaker state than they inherited. So there is a pretty nasty feedback loop. You're right. How to break it? Look, state building is a long, slow process. It's most likely to occur in small, sort of easy terrains with relatively homogeneous populations. Those conditions outside of Costa Rica and Uruguay don't really exist in much of Latin America. The other great paradox about state building is elites commit to state building when they're afraid, when they fear for their security. So it is usually war, the threat of war, insurgency, that gets elites to fork over taxes and contribute to state building. Whether the crime issue can be a substitute for that and induce elites to support state building over time, perhaps. But I mean, I don't mean to be too rainy or pessimistic, but state building is a long, slow process. Nobody ever in any society, I guess possible exception of Israel and Taiwan, has figured out how to build a strong state overnight. It's a long process, and unfortunately, instability and populist governments tend to worsen the problem rather than better. It's hard, and we're seeing that in the 21st century. Populist governments, whatever state building achievements you saw in different countries, including in Peru, are getting hacked at, or getting weakened and rolled back under outsider governments. So, boy, that was depressing. Sorry. Thank you.
So I agree with you that populism in principle poses a serious threat to democracy, but I wonder whether you don't overestimate how often that actually comes to fruition, because we can all think of the Chavezes and Fujimoris and Correas and whatever, but we tend to forget the many populists who tried and fell by the wayside, you know, the Bucarams and the Gutierrezes and the Collors and the Lugos and the Celayas and the many populists who were in office and didn't destroy democracy, you know, Mara and Toledo and Menem and Uribe and whatever. And so I wonder whether you don't overestimate the threat. Partly also because, you know, populism also serves as a deterrent example, like I think Charles has had an impact on other countries in Latin America, and there's learning from populism. I mean, one reason why democracy has hung on so long in Peru is why that after Fujimori there was a deliberate effort to avoid this kind of thing. And so I see the threat, but I wonder whether you don't overestimate it.
I don't want to conflate populists and outsiders. I didn't spend much time on this, but I don't think that we're seeing a much higher, we can agree that there are many more outsiders getting elected today than 20 or 30 years ago. That seems to be increasing, and possibly, it's a little early to say, that data is still, it's pretty small n, but seems to maybe be accelerating in recent years. In virtually every country in the region in the last 5 years, in many cases, both candidates in the runoff, I mean, Lula was actually an exception. Both candidates in the runoff are either personally political amateurs in that they've never held office before, they come from a new political force that has never governed at the national level. So outsiders are getting elected everywhere. Not all of them are populists. I have a slightly more demanding definition of populism than you do. My populists have to campaign very clearly against the political establishment to win office. So I don't think I would consider Kohler a populist. You know Kohler much better than I do. But I didn't consider Menem a populist. But so a lot of, I didn't consider Fernando Lugo a populist. And Toledo wasn't a populist. So a lot of outsiders get elected and who govern democratically or fail, I wouldn't have called them necessarily populists. But it is true that some populists fail. Bucaram and Lucio Gutierrez are excellent examples. I hope to God that you're right, that we learn from populist experiences. I'm not as optimistic as you are. But what I think is that among the group of outsiders that get elected each year or each decade, a certain number of them are going to be populists. And those guys run a higher risk. They don't always succeed. They don't always assault democratic institutions. They sometimes fail. But I think the fact that outsider candidates, outsider candidates are a crapshoot. And we're just playing that game more frequently now than before. So there's no guarantee of anything, but I think the probability of electing a populist who goes on to assault democratic institutions is higher in 2022 than it was in 1995.
Thank you for being here today. And my question is, looking at, for example, countries in the West, especially Europe, and how many extremist parties are gaining more power, for example, in Italy, and more support, I wonder what your opinion is on how could in the future years, the support for these parties could look like in the international environment for West countries, not only on the inside of these countries domestically, but also in contact with other countries.
That's a really, I mean, the rise of a transnational illiberal right. Again, I'm not, some of them are populist, they're not all populist. I'm not sure I would necessarily call them populist, but the illiberal right, which is quite transnational, is pretty worrisome because it includes parties that are competing in stable democracies in Western Europe, and it includes authoritarian figures like Orban in Hungary. And you're seeing increasingly folks on the, in right-wing parties like the Republican Party embracing and openly supporting illiberal far-right projects, particularly in Hungary. Now, we shouldn't, that's not a good sign. I don't think it is necessarily indicative as much as we sometimes think it is, because the democratic left in Latin America has spent decades adoring authoritarians on the left, whether from Castro to Chavez. So, you know, the right in Brazil has excoriated Lula, and this recent round, kind of inexplicably, you know, concluded that Lula was a threat to democracy because the PT, you know, cannot break up with the Chavista regime in Venezuela. It's terrible that the PT can't break up with the Chavista regime. That doesn't mean that the PT would govern undemocratically. So the fact that the Republican Party adores Viktor Orban, or that the Italian ex-neo-fascists adore Orban and even Putin is not necessarily an indication of how they will govern. I think it's a mixed bag in Europe. I mean, so far, the far right in Europe, I don't like them. I don't agree with many of their policies, and they're pretty illiberal. But they've behaved in Europe, unlike the United States, they've behaved in Europe so far in a pretty democratic fashion. Will that change? I don't know. But so far, I wouldn't call any of the far right parties. I'm writing a book where we call the Republican Party of the United States authoritarian. I would not call most far right parties in Europe. I would not put them in the same group.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what seems to be a paradox. You said that there is a reaction, a negative reaction among some to higher rates of electoral inclusion, and that you feel that that is coming to Latin America. So, you know, in other words, minorities, women, people who don't normally hold office are voting more, have more access to the polls and possibly to holding office, but they have also been traditionally excluded by the political establishment, which is one of the apparatuses that sort of keeps things intact politically and keeps them from devolving. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that paradox and what you know, how you see it maybe righting itself and not, you know, taking governments apart, et cetera. I don't know exactly how to frame your question.
Not sure I'm understanding entirely the question, but I mean, these are two processes that have occurred at the same time: the weakening of political establishments and greater inclusion. So, you know, women and African Americans, I'm going to talk about the United States for a second, have gained more political power in the United States at roughly the same time that the establishment has weakened. And there's no question that, for example, or no question, I think there's a good chance that had the old pre-1972 candidate selection system existed in the Democratic Party in 2008, there's a good chance Barack Obama would not have been nominated. But I'm not sure they're the same thing. I'm not sure that greater inclusion and establishment weakening are the inclusion of previously excluded groups, whether that's the same thing as establishment weakening. Weakening of the establishment may accelerate the process of bringing previously excluded groups into power, but these are societal changes that are going on across the West that I'd have to think more about it, but I'm not sure that they're necessarily intertwined with the weakening of the establishment. In other words, it's entirely possible, I think, to have an inclusive establishment. The establishment doesn't have to be, you know, rich old white men from Lima. The establishment can be much more representative, much more inclusive. The U.S. establishment is much more representative and inclusive than it was before, which is one of the reasons why populism in the United States is right-wing. The people who really, really hate the establishment are the MAGA folks, the guys who want to go back to the 50s. So they occurred together in time, but I'm not sure there is a causal relationship between the two.
Thank you, Levitsky. I'd like to ask you about the political cost of the fight against corruption in Latin America.
The political cost, this is it's a tough one. So, you know, institutions of accountability are working to some degree in Latin America today, right? All those Salvadoran and Peruvian presidents in jail, something's working, right? People are a number of politicians, whether it's Brazil or Peru or Costa Rica or El Salvador, who have been corrupt, have been held accountable. That's in part been electoral competition, in part it's been the media, in part it's been stronger judiciaries. Institutions of oversight, both formal and informal, are not working perfectly, but they're working much better, and they are actually holding politicians to account for corruption in a way that we've never seen before in Latin America. That might well be contributing to an erosion of public trust in democratic institutions. I mean, I look at Peru, I'm an idiot, but I look at Peru and say, wow, they busted every former president for corruption. The system seems to work. Peruvians look at that and say, Jesus Christ, all the political elites suck, and we want nothing to do with it. Corruption is not new in Latin America, which is one of the, I guess, an implication of your question. It may, in fact, be lower than it was 70 or 80 years ago. In some countries, it's definitely lower than it was 70 or 80 years ago. We know much more about it thanks to democracy. And that, paradoxically, is maybe undermining people's trust in democratic institutions. Like, how can you love Peru's political elite if everybody seems to be demonstrably corrupt? How can you live through Lava Jato in Brazil and say, yeah, let's embrace the political elite? Same thing in El Salvador. I mean, it's not a total mystery why Bukele defeated the dominant parties. It's not a total mystery why AMLO defeated the dominant parties in Mexico. So yeah, I don't have a way out of that one either.
Steve, I wanted to ask you how useful you think the term democracy still is here. I mean, it might be politically or professionally inconvenient because the title of your last book has the word, the title of this talk has the word. It sounds like the next book is going to have the word in it. But I just wonder whether it's analytically useful anymore. In some ways, here in the US, when we have candidates who look like they're not going to accept the results of an election, it hits at the heart of democracy, so it feels like democracy. But a lot of the other things you've talked about are about things that might be, I don't know, better thought of as aspects of democracy or even related concepts of democracy, which might allow us to really get at these problems a little better. So for example, the survey you put up in which showed satisfaction with democracy across a bunch of countries, I don't know, say the 8% of Brazilians who are satisfied with democracy, what exactly they're talking about, and they're probably talking about a whole bunch of other things. Do you think it might be more useful to start thinking about other concepts and identify them and work on them in that way?
No. Well, look, I share what I think is your skepticism of taking too seriously public opinion on democracy, because people have really, really different. So I want to distinguish between political scientists and surveys of people. In surveys, I agree with you. We can't learn a hell of a lot from public opinion polls about democracy everywhere, including the United States, because people have really, really mixed and sometimes very confused understandings of democracy. The satisfaction with democracy, I didn't show the data, of course, but it's interesting and somewhat important because there's been a decline over time. Brazil wasn't always at 8%. It was never at 80%. But satisfaction with democracy, according to that survey, has gone down pretty markedly in the last decade in much of the regions. That tells us something. Same question gives you a different result. But in terms of whether democracy is a useful concept, of course it's a useful concept. I mean, there are other things going on. There were other things going on in my talk that have to do with the state and not with democracy. And so I think democracy unfortunately, I think one of the great, this gets back to the last question about corruption. Democracy gets the blame for things that are actually the state's fault. The regime, the government gets blamed for things that are rooted in state weakness, and eventually the regime, the political system, gets blamed for stuff that has to do with the state, with economies, with societies that don't have to do with the political rules of gaining and maintaining power. But and maybe it's because I just have a small brain, but to me that doesn't lead us to set aside the concept of democracy. We should be studying these other things, but political regime matters. It matters the politics in Peru in the 2000s were different from politics in Peru in the 1990s. Politics politics in Venezuela in the 70s were different from politics in Venezuela in the early 2000s. Regime, even defined minimally in terms of elections, who can participate, and broad protection of civil liberties, make a difference. They don't make nearly the difference that people expect them to and want them to. But I think it makes a difference, so I think it's worth keeping the conceptual distinction.
I noticed a strong emphasis being placed on elections for chief executives and the rise of outsiders and populists for chief executive elections. Are these changes also mirrored in regional elections and legislative elections? Or is there an element of economies of scale with social media that's playing into this happening with chief executives?
That is a great question. And I actually do not have the data in front of me, so I can only give you kind of anecdotal evidence. And I haven't really seen the data collected. Based on the cases that I know, it is also happening at the local, the regional, and the legislative level. Certainly in Peru, it's happening up and down the board. But I have not, it's a really important and great question that we'll have to go back and look.
Well, thank you for your talk. So I was wondering, you draw a picture of the democracy in Latin America actually increasing, a little bit decreasing lately. But I was wondering, how is that working when we read the data about Latin America and how people actually prefer to have an authoritarian government because they offer these like very quick answers, right? We see Bukele as the answer for crime, and we see that his image is used in many countries in Latin America as, you know, the politician that is solving crime very quickly. So how would you say that, you know, we have this increasing democracy in Latin America, but at the same time we have people who actually prefer to have an authoritarian government to solve problems very quickly? Would you say that that's thanks to the political establishment that is now weakening?
No, I mean, that risk always exists. And especially it exists when times are difficult and when governments don't perform well. So this is not the first time, and Nayib Bukele is not the first authoritarian model for folks in Latin America. You know, Pinochet was a model. Velasco was a model, and Castro was a model. Fujimori was a model. Every decade has its authoritarian model that people turn to and say, look, this guy gets stuff done better than democratic governments do. That's unfortunately always going to be a risk, especially when you've got sort of mediocre performing democracies. And you know, democracies that don't perform well or that operate in a context of extreme inequality and state weakness are always going to be rather vulnerable. And one vulnerability is going to be somebody's going to seize power and achieve short-term success at something, like Fujimori did with hyperinflation and the Shining Path, and everyone's saying, hey, let's be like that. That is not new. I don't think it'll ever go away. But, you know, over time, most of those guys fail, right? In year 3, the Bukeles and the Fujimoris always look great. And in year 10, it's usually a more mixed record. And that gets to the learning that Kurt was talking about. Most of these populist experiences, left, right, and center, don't end well. So the lesson is not always. The lesson for a while seems to be, wow, these guys can do it better than democratic governments. But in the medium and long term, Often not so much.
That's a pretty good segue, actually. Now, I don't expect you to be Nostradamus here, but I would like to return to the comment made by Kurt with respect to the question of learning. So you do identify two key trends of interest for me, and those being the international arena and the sort of lack of liberal democracy as the hegemonic model in today's age, and at the same time, the increasing democratization of media that may actually allow for more intra-regional communication between aspiring populist leaders. So I guess my question is, what do you think are the prospects for historically less influential regimes, regionally speaking, such as Bukele in El Salvador, to have an outsized influence as a potential model for new anti-establishment authoritarians?
It could be. I mean, the terms of politics have changed dramatically. I told you the story of Sao Paulo. These are pretty smart guys who didn't see YouTube and WhatsApp coming in 2018. So things are changing very quickly. Bukele learned very quickly, more quickly than obviously than most, how to play this game well. I mean, I shouldn't get. Kurt can tell you more about diffusion than I can, but diffusion is not new, but it does happen very quickly these days. And so Bukele has developed some techniques that will be replicated. Interesting question about small states. I mean, it's interesting how influential Hungary is right now, too. That said, Cuba was very influential in the 1960s, and Cuba was also pretty small. So I have to think more about it, but I'm not. What you say makes sense in theory, that smaller countries could become models more easily, but it has happened before, so I'm not sure. Great question.